I would like to mention that it's a really tough question to try to answer. What is better? A simple rule, which it has some beauty on it. I have mentioned that Basel I is so simple as the rule of 8% of capital requirement. It's beauty because you can understand it, you can transmit this idea. It's easy to review if you are accomplishing to that performance, but it doesn't reflect the real risk you're taking in your assets or in your balance in general. But going against advanced financial models, considering all kind of models, not only for market, for derivatives, for credit risk, or also operational risk. I guess if financial models are some sort of representation of what, any issue we are dealing with, and trying to understand how those process or that issue performs given certain drivers in the macroeconomic environment, and also given certain drivers in the specific financial issue you are dealing with. In my point of view, models are essentially necessary to understand. But it's necessary an equilibrium not only of models as well as judgment. I guess judgment comes from experience, and sometimes experience comes from bad judgment. So you need not only simple rules. I guess one of the best advantages new regulation has is the way models understand risk, really. If you apply a simple rule for any bank across the country or across the world, and you ask only for an 8% or 10.5% like Basel III does, and you ask any bank to accomplish that proportion without considering the real risk any bank is taking, it doesn't work. So in my point of view, the beauty of a simple rule is necessary, but at the same time, the complex world we're living in requires financial models. But I see financial models as some instruments and some tools who helps you to navigate. But at the end of the day, the one who is taking the decisions is the person in charge, the group or the man in charge of the decision. So models are required, are necessary. In my point of view, they are indispensable. But at the end of the day, judgment and experience is completely necessary. Trying to answer honestly is a very difficult question. I guess if we can create, if regulators are able to create complex regulation, applying advanced models, but trying to simplify the way it is communicated and it is applied, could be the ideal world. But that's not exactly the way it can be done actually. So I guess you need a balance between simplicity or simple rules and good models in order to represent a process or a phenomenon given certain conditions. So in my point of view, both of them are necessary.
So, well, in general terms, what you are saying is you agree with the proposals of Basel III because they actually have that balance that you mentioned, which has still insist on the internal models use, reloaded, plus the leverage ratio, which works parallel.
In some way, yes. I had to agree with Basel III because it gives me a lot of work these years. No. I agree with what you mentioned, Alan. Yes, completely. I guess you need a balance between both of them, and I guess it's an evolution. If it could be a huge mistake than using financial models to understand financial risk.
Why are we regulating? We want to ensure that there is no systemic risk, that there isn't a collective collapse of the banking infrastructure, as it were, and that promulgates regulation, whether it's simple, easy to understand, and more than effective Basel I structures, or the more complex Basel III model-driven proposals that are out there right now. With that backdrop, you want to stop and say, what is the regulator's responsibility here? The regulator says, right, increase the margins that you're holding, increase capital adequacy from 8 to 10 to 10.5 to 12 to 14, do this and do that. What happens if the bank turns around and says, I am a simple, honest to God, good bank. I don't fool around in the derivatives marketplace. I am not besieged and beset by greed. If, because of a systemic problem, if I were to go under, what is the guarantee that you will bail me out? And to which there has been stunning silence. If you look at this lender of last resort theory, that was essentially the underpinning of central banks worldwide. Central banks effectively kept quiet when Northern Rock went under, when Royal Bank of Scotland went under, when Lloyds was effectively taken over by the taxpayer. So there must be some logic to the regulation. Regulation for the sake of regulation is pointless. And keeping more margins is limiting trade. It is going to impact margins. It is going to reduce SME finance. It is going to be a detriment to cross-border transactions. And so what you're trying to tell organizations is don't do something by putting in huge impediments. It would be much better if your regulation was more practical. I give you a simple example. In the City of London, there are around 350 banks and around 750 representative offices, and they are asked to produce liquidity reports weekly. The FSA, which now no longer is in existence and it's gone back to the Bank of England, has 40 analysts who are essentially looking at 750 pieces of paper every week. Now my math is weak, so please help me here. 40 people looking at 750 pieces of paper on a 5-day horizon. What will they look at? What will they comment? What will they critique? And how will they stop systemic risk? The answer has to be, you must allow people to do business. That's the American way. That's the way we've all believed in. And what we should do is the regulation should be tied in to some very concrete guarantees, if you will, on the part of the regulator. That you do your part, and if there is something systemic that goes wrong, I'll step in and save you. That's not happening.
Maybe some small and medium institutions will not have enough resources to develop full internal models. Maybe. That's why regulation also needs some part or some sort of simplicity in order to be used. But if a small or medium institution is not able to develop enough knowledge and financial risk management technology, in my point of view, will be some disadvantage against some institutions, maybe big institutions, that have enough resources to develop advanced methodologies and advanced models to understand and to manage risk. I don't know if that's your point. I guess regulation cannot ask the same requirements for small and medium institutions as well as for big institutions. Mm-hmm. Also because systemic risk is implicit on that. I just remember last April or May in the banking convention here in Mexico, which is annually held, Timothy Geithner was the keynote speaker, and one of the questions that was made to him, and I suppose many people ask that, is always, if you had against the decision in your hands of Lehman Brothers, will you give it go the same way you did, or will you change your mind? And the answer was simple and smart. Next time we will make a decision to leave go any institution, we need to make sure we have clear where far it will go, the impact. You cannot let go bankruptcy any institution again if you're not sure how far the relations of that institution are going to be causing any problem. So if you consider that only big institutions need advanced internal models, considering systemic risk, I agree. But at the same time, I guess those big institutions will have some advantage being able to choose the risk they want to include in their balances, in their assets or liabilities, and the way they are pricing those assets, and the way they are dealing with those risks. So I guess there is, in some way, an arbitrage in regulation if advanced models are required the same way for small, medium, and large companies or large banks. But that will be something very difficult to differentiate. I don't see the way regulators can apply the same level of regulation for small banks and for big banks. I don't know.
Well, just one reflection on that one. We have to remember that regulation is made to protect the depositors, and depositors are not any different from small and big
You're right.
banks.
Yes.
If you wanted to be cynical, you would say that we had this too big to fail problem with these banks, so we've introduced these CCPs, and now we've got another too big to fail problem. If LCH ClearNet fails, that's going to be a much bigger problem than any of the banks failing. So, that's in terms of systemic risk, we may have actually created a monster here. But I don't feel so bad about it, and I'll tell you why. And I think I did mention this at breakfast this morning, but banks are incredibly complex organizations, almost impossibly complex. If you ever try reading bank financial statements and trying to get any idea about what risks the bank's taking, what its derivative portfolio looks like, or anything, it's impossible. I mean, regulators have my sympathy, because it's an incredibly complex business to understand what banks are doing, what risks they're taking, and that sort of thing. CCPs are a lot simpler. I mean, just to understand their operation, what they're doing, whether they're taking risks, whether their initial margins are enough, and that sort of thing. So it may not be such a bad thing. I'm sort of not taking the cynical view that we've created a monster, and this monster is much worse than the previous monster. I think that the movement towards central clearing is a good thing. I think it will take on a life of its own. I think that central clearing parties will get more confident clearing a wider range of derivatives. Banks will be less inclined to trade we're already seeing this, the more exotic products. So more and more things will go through central clearing parties, and I predict, and I said this morning, that 10, 15 years down the road, it'll be very difficult to tell the difference between over-the-counter markets and exchange-traded markets. I mean, exchanges like the CME are getting into the over-the-counter business in terms of the clearing they're doing and that sort of thing. And some of their products are actually amalgams. I mean, if you look at the CME product, which is, a futures on a swap, for example, it's actually, when you exercise, or an option on a swap, when you exercise the option, you actually get a swap, which is an over-the-counter product. So I see the a convergence between the over-the-counter market and the exchange-traded market. And to get back to your question, on the whole, I'm fairly optimistic in terms of systemic risk and the reduction in systemic risk that is being created by CCPs, because I think CCPs are things you can regulate. They're fundamentally much easier to regulate than banks. And so transferring the regulatory burden, to some extent anyway, from banks to CCPs is not a bad thing.